They were a group of outcasts. People thought they were absolutely crazy to try something so outlandish as to risk their lives for what many scholars considered as pseudoscience. Almost 70 years later, and space agencies like NASA have these men to thank for their work in pioneering early rocketry. This is the story of Jack Parsons, Frank Malina, and Edward S Forman, dubbed the Suicide Squad. Let's take a moment and talk about it. Hello, 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 and welcome back to Moment of Zen, a podcast about everything and nothing. I'm your host, as always, Johnson Zen, and before I begin, I just want to thank you all so much for your support. And of course, if you're enjoying this podcast, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe for more. Thank you. And just a quick update. Hope you all had an amazing Thanksgiving. I didn't get a chance to record an episode last week because I was too busy stuffing myself with food that I couldn't speak onto the microphone. But in sort of recent news, though this would be pretty late for you when this comes out, I just want to congratulate NASA and JPL and all the amazing folks that worked on the Mars InSight rover, which just landed on the red planet last week safely. It's a huge accomplishment for humanity and science, and with that rover, scientists will be able to learn more about the interior of Mars and how terrestrial planets in general, like Earth, formed billions of years ago. And of course, the success of InSight and NASA and JPL wouldn't be possible if not for the three gentlemen I'm going to talk about today. So let's take a little trip in our time machine back to the late 1920s and early 1930s to my hometown area of Los Angeles, California. At this time, it's the peak of the Great Depression, and many families are struggling across the country and around the world. For the most part, no one was really safe from the effects of the Great Depression, but the degree with which people were affected by the economic downturn varied. Most people lost their jobs and lost their livelihoods and everything, but that was not the case for the first member of the Suicide Squad, Mr. Jack Parsons. Born Marvel Whiteside Parsons to parents Ruth Virginia Whiteside and Marvel H. Parsons, Jack, as he was called by his family, was born on October 2nd, 1914 in Los Angeles, California. So right after Jack is born, Marvel and Ruth's marriage falls apart after Ruth finds out that Marvel had been frequenting a number of sex workers around the downtown LA area. She immediately files for divorce in 1915, and Marvel moves back to Massachusetts, and she forbids him from having any contact with Jack. So Ruth's parents, Jack's grandparents, who were very wealthy, also moved to California to be closer with their daughter and grandson, and they buy a house in Pasadena, which is just outside of Los Angeles. So growing up, Jack was living the very high life, and he was always surrounded by personal butlers and attendants and people of high status and wealth. And because of this, he didn't know many children his own age and spent most of his time reading alone. And this is where he developed his interest in science fiction, and through the works of Jules Verne, he also becomes interested in rocketry. When Jack is 12, he attended Washington Junior High School, where he didn't do very well. Some sources say that Jack had a case of undiagnosed dyslexia, which I can't confirm nor deny because it seemed that he did a lot of reading when he was a child, so dyslexia just seems very unlikely. But it is at this junior high school where Jack meets the second member of what will eventually be the Suicide Squad, Edward S Forman. So there's not a lot of information I could find about Ed, but what we do know is that Jack and Ed sort of formed an unpopular friendship because Ed came from a poor working class family, while Jack, as you may know, came from a very wealthy family. But what brought these two together were that they were both interested in science fiction and, in particular, rocketry. They began experimenting with homemade gunpowder based rockets in the Arroyo Seco Canyon. And just a quick aside for those of you who aren't familiar with the LA area or Pasadena, the city is sort of sandwiched in between the San Gabriel Mountains northeast of downtown LA, and there is this stream that cuts through the city from the mountains, and it's a sort of very hilly and rocky area that bisects and forms what is known as the San Gabriel Valley, which is where I'm originally from. Back to Jack and Ed. The two boys would experiment with their rudimentary rockets in the mountains, and you would easily know where they were experimenting because of all the small craters they were leaving behind from their failed tests. They incorporated fireworks like cherry bombs into their rockets and eventually experimented using aluminum foil to cast their gunpowder. By 1929, Jack is now in high school, and his bad grades didn't sit well with his mother. So Ruth sends her son to the Brown Military Academy for Boys in San Diego. So at the academy, Jack ends up getting expelled because he blows up a toilet. And no, he did not have explosive diarrhea. He was, of course, experimenting with his rockets. So after his incident, the Parsons spend the rest of 1929 in Europe before moving back to Pasadena. And in 1931, Jack begins studying at University School. And yes, that is the name of the extremely creative name of his new high school, if you want to call it that. So, despite his poor performance in high school, he was actually doing very well at university school. His teachers, many of whom studied in nearby Caltech or the California Institute of Technology, which is one of the top 5 universities in the nation, I think at least top 10 in the world, they noticed that Jack had an affinity for chemistry, and they sort of helped push him towards that field. 1931 was also the year that Jack's grandfather dies, and with his death, as well as the deepening of the Great Depression, the Parson family's wealth noticeably begins to dwindle. And this forces Jack to take up a part time job at the Hercules Powder Company, where he learned more about explosives and their potential use in rocketry. Meanwhile, Ed is also continuing work independently on his childhood passion for rocketry, and he reunites with Jack on their free time to continue their experiments from their childhood. Jack, in many occasions, borrows a few items and materials from his workplace at the powder factory and was eventually able to create an early version of a solid fuel rocket engine. I know this sounds really complicated and it is sort of rocket science, but the only thing you really need to know about a solid fuel rocket engine is that, its name is very sort of self-explanatory. It's a rocket engine that uses fuel that is solid rather than fuel that is liquid. So your car, it runs on gasoline, which means it's a liquid engine because the fuel that it uses is a liquid. With a liquid fuel, if you want to stop or go faster, you can cut off the fuel or increase the amount of fuel you're burning to go faster or stop. However, with solid fuel, once you ignite it, you can't really add more fuel to it to make it go faster, or you can't really stop the fuel from burning once it's started because once it lights up, it just goes. So the development of the solid rocket engine led Jack and Ed to come into contact with Mr. Werner Magnus Maximilian Feuer von Braun. And if you don't know who that is, don't worry. I may do an episode on him in the future because he's basically one of the leading figures in the development of rocketry in Germany and the US. And it was through his help and expertise that NASA was able to compete with the Soviet Union and eventually beat the Soviets to the moon during the space race. And to the folks in the aerospace industry, we wouldn't be where we are today if not for his contributions. Though he is a bit of a controversial person because of his German ties during the Second World War. But that's a story for another day. Just know that von Braun is a very important person in the aerospace industry. And so it was a very big deal that Jack and Ed were able to correspond with him at such a young age. So Jack graduates from university school in 1933 and he enrolls in Pasadena Junior College, which today is known as Pasadena City College. Shout out to all my friends that went to PCC. So his original plan was to graduate from Pasadena Junior College with an associate's degree in either physics or chemistry. But because of the financial situation he was in, he opted to drop out and work full-time at the Hercules Powder Company instead. In doing so, he moves to Hercules, California, which is northeast of Berkeley in the San Francisco Bay Area. He makes a decent wage at about $100 a month, which comes to about $1,900 in today's money. And while Jack was working there, he began developing massive headaches because of his exposure to nitroglycerin, which is the main component of dynamite. So after working at Hercules for about a year, Jack saved up his money and began attending Stanford University for a degree in chemistry. But like with what happened at his junior college, Jack opted to drop out again because he couldn't afford the tuition. So after dropping out of Stanford, Jack moves back to his mother's house in Pasadena. That he's back home, Jack reunites with his childhood friend Ed, and they come up with this brilliant idea of attending lectures at Caltech to learn more about rocketry. And one of the lectures that the two attend is a lecture by Austrian rocket engineer Eugene Sanger. So at that lecture, Jack and Ed meet a PhD student named William Belay, who was doing research on rocket-powered aircraft. The two approached Belay and expressed their interest to him about designing a liquid fuel rocket motor. Belay didn't really want to have anything to do with the two, so he redirects them to another PhD student named Frank Malina. So if this were a movie right now, we meet the third member of the squad. So, the Avengers assembled, or rather the Suicide Squad assembled. So Frank Malina was a mathematician and mechanical engineer, and he was working on a thesis about rocket propulsion. So a little bit about Frank. He was also born on October 2nd, but was born 2 years earlier than Jack in 1912, and he was from Brenham, Texas. His father is of Czech descent, and there's not much information about his mother, but I assume she's also of Czech descent. There's not a lot of information about his early childhood, but what we do know is that he graduated from Texas A&M in 1934 with a degree in mechanical engineering, and he moved to California shortly after for graduate school at Caltech. So Frank earned his master's degree 1 year later in 1935 before starting his PhD in 1936. And this is where he meets up with Jack and Ed. The trio, they quickly become friends as they shared a mutual interest in rocketry. The three then applied for funding from Caltech together to study rocket propulsion, but they didn't let the university know that their ultimate goal was to develop rockets for space exploration. The reason why this key detail was left out was because in the 1930s, the idea of going to space, let alone with rockets, was just unheard of or crazy. The consensus was that space exploration was purely science fiction. And that would be similar to saying today that you want to apply for funding to research warp drive. The general consensus, at least today, is that a warp drive is purely science fiction and it's impossible to actually create a warp drive. So funding for it would be a complete waste of money and you would probably not get any funding for it. And that was sort of the same mentality scientists had back then when it came to rockets taking people to space or just the idea of space travel at all. Frank's doctoral advisor, Theodore von Karman, saw the potential in the idea that these young men had and agreed to let them do their research at the university under the guise of the Guggenheim Aeronautical Laboratory, or GALSIT. Doing this allowed them access to university resources such as different labs and machine shops at Caltech. Remember, technically only Frank out of the three is a student at Caltech, and it's a little crazy now to think that a professor would let these two relatively unknown people in Jack and Ed to use university resources like this, especially since Jack and Ed don't really have any formal qualifications or degrees. You know, they're both technically college dropouts, though I don't know if Ed ever went to college. So the only caveat to this was that because they were in the Great Depression, von Karman, he wasn't able to secure any financial funding for the three to do the research, so they had to get all the materials themselves. And it is at this moment in the fictional movie that I'm sort of portraying that we have the squad assembled. We have Jack, who is the chemist and the expert in the rocket fuel. Ed was the machinist, who was the guy that they needed to build the different parts for the rockets. And finally, we have Frank, who was the sort of brains of the squad and provided the formal scientific expertise that Jack and Ed lacked. Frank, as far as I know, he never really looked down on Jack or Ed because of their lack of formal education. I think it would be very easy for someone who's so highly educated as Frank to put himself in this pedestal above those who aren't as educated as him. So I found it very noble and humble of him to treat Jack and Ed as equals in their research together. It was a very interesting dynamic between the three of them. Jack and Ed, because of their lack of formal education, they were very much more creative with their ideas and were much more eager to try whatever sort of idea that just popped into their head. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, it didn't really matter to them. And this was a sharp contrast to Frank, who was much more disciplined in his approach because of his scientific background. He approached the research in a very methodical way that followed the scientific method. And it was because of this push and pull dynamic between the calculating Frank and the more impulsive Jack and Ed that I think that these three were so successful. Fast forward 1 year, and the squad has now nearly tripled in size with the addition of Caltech grad students Apollo M. Smith, Carlos C. Wood, Mark Muir Mills, Fred S. Miller, William C. Rockefeller, and Rudolph Schott. First liquid fuel rocket motor test occurred on Halloween 1936 near the Devil's Gate Dam in the Arroyo Seco Canyons. So the motor consisted of an oxygen pump on one side with a methyl alcohol tank and nitrogen flowing on the other side of the motor. Water was used to cool the engine during the burn, and a spring was used to measure the thrust on the rocket. And now that everything was in place, it was time to test. They pump the fuel and oxygen into the motor, and Jack moves into the motor and ignites it. And nothing happens. That's all right. That's all right. Let's restart. Try this again. Tick two. And it fails again. Third time's the charm, right? Guess not this time, and the motor fails for a third time. So on the fourth attempt, the oxygen line was accidentally ignited, and if you know anything about combustion, oxygen is extremely flammable. So on this fourth attempt, we'll hire Michael Bay to direct this part of the movie because the oxygen line ignites and explodes. Luckily, no one was hurt, and to many of us, this may seem like a failure, but this really encouraged the group, and it only helped to fuel them, no pun intended, to continue their experiments through the new year. So in January 1937, the group manages to successfully test their first liquid-fueled rocket motor. The rocket burned for an astonishing 3 seconds before it went out, and with this accomplishment, Von Karman rewards the group by letting them test their rocket on campus. And it is here on campus that the group began to gain a lot of notoriety and received the name Suicide Squad because of how dangerous their experiments were. By 1938, the Suicide Squad improved their motor to burn for about 1 minute. And fast forward to 1940, Frank finishes his PhD, and if you remember from history class, World War II had just started not too long ago, and the US military began to take notice of the so-called Suicide Squad, and Frank approaches the National Academy of Science to request additional funding for their rocket research. He referred to the research as, quote, jet propulsion, to avoid any sort of stigma that came with rockets. And it was also sort of used as a sort of selling point to the military because they were interested in jet propulsion for their aircraft. At first, they were offered $1,000 to put together a proposal for the project, which made the group the first US government-sanctioned rocket research group. And in their proposal, Jack reported that the rockets that they were building and experimenting with were capable of reaching velocities upward of 4,875 miles per hour, or about 7,845 kilometers per hour, or about 2,200 meters per second. This is pretty impressive given that at that point, they were basically working with little to no funding from the university, and for them to reach a max velocity of nearly 5,000 miles per hour, that's just really mind-boggling and crazy. For context, this rocket would not have made it to space since it would require a velocity of about 18,000 miles per hour or about 29,000 kilometers per hour to escape Earth's gravity. It's still impressive nonetheless, and with this proposal, they were able to receive about $10,000 in grants for their research. About a quarter of that money wasn't actually used for research, but instead went to pay back the university for different repairs and damages that the group was causing because of their experiments. And I think Von Karman now, he really regrets allowing the group to do their experiments on campus. The same can be said for a number of Caltech professors and researchers who were getting tired of the group's destruction around campus, and not to mention the amount of noise they were making with each test. So the group was forced to relocate back to the original spot in the Rio Seco Canyons. Because of their commitment to the US military, they were forced to cater their research towards jet-assisted takeoff, or JATO, which was what the military was interested in. After a number of experiments that ended up in explosions, the group sort of gave up on their pursuit of trying to create a solid rocket motor engine, and instead opted to switch to a liquid-fueled one instead. The solid fuel was much more volatile because of the main component, aluminum nitrate, which was too combustible because of how poorly it was being stored. Jack, Ed, and Frank were also motivated by the fact that the US military had officially entered the Second World War in 1941, and since the three were sort of anti-war pacifists, they knew that if they didn't produce any results for the military, that they were in danger of being drafted. A bit ironic how they were anti-war, but they're technically working for the military so that the military can go off to war. Finally, in 1942, Frank was able to successfully solve and create a rocket engine with a stable fuel that reduced the takeoff time of an aircraft by about 30%. The group formed the Aerojet Engineering Corporation to manufacture and sell their rocket engine to the military. And it is at this point in the movie that, the group has made it. We're at the climax. They've accomplished what they're striving for, and was sort of how most groups typically end up. The Suicide Squad informally disbands in 1943 when the Galset research group splits up, with Frank, Jack, and Ed moving on to their company Aerojet, and the rest of the group, they sort of move forward with the newfound military research facility called the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. And that is the story of the Suicide Squad and the origins of JPL. So, like in any movie, now it's time to roll the credits. So Frank continued his career with Aerojet, but eventually grew more dissatisfied with rocketry and grew to hate it because of how the Cold War was forcing rocket research to develop weapons instead of conducting more scientific research. His distaste in what his creations had become led him away from rocket research altogether, and because of his early interest in communism during the early 1930s, he also attracted the attention of the FBI and was eventually forced to leave Aerojet and move to France. The FBI took this as a sort of sign of guilt, and he was declared a fugitive and would be arrested on sight if he were to return to the States. In France, Frank becomes an artist and painter and focused on art that bridged the contemporary arts with technology. He died in 1981 in a small town just outside of Paris, France. So there's not a lot of information about Ed's life, as I mentioned before. All we know is that Ed was an incredible machinist and continued to work at Aerojet until it was bought out by General Tire in 1944. And after General Tire bought out Aerojet, Ed was laid off, and he tried unsuccessfully several times to open up his own business, but they all eventually sort of failed. And after these failed attempts at creating his own business, he moves to the San Francisco Bay Area to work at Lockheed in Sunnyvale, California, which is just a few miles north of San Jose. He spends the rest of his life working at Lockheed before he died on February 12th, 1973. Finally, we have Jack. So there's a lot to uncover about Jack, even though he does die pretty young at the age of 37. I can take an entire episode to talk about Jack Parsons, but there's an incredible podcast called Stuff They Don't Want You to Know, who already made a really good episode detailing all about Jack's interesting life. You should definitely check it out if you haven't already. But I'll just kind of sort of briefly go over Jack's interesting life outside of rocketry. And if this sounds interesting to you, definitely check out their podcast. So from a young age, Jack has always had a sort of fascination with the occult, and that plays a huge role in what he does outside of rocketry. And one of the things he does is he joins a sex cult founded by the infamous Aleister Crowley. He's also accused by the government for espionage because of his ties to the cult. So a number of different events unfold, and Jack has lost his job working in the aerospace industry because during the Cold War, the government now required workers to have security clearances, and they weren't going to issue Jack one because of his involvement with the cult. And this causes Jack to go into a sort of depression since he can't continue to work on his childhood passion of rocketry. And in 1952, Jack decides to move to Mexico to work at an explosives factory. And being in Mexico would allow him to bypass the US restrictions on him. However, before Jack could leave for Mexico, while working at his home laboratory, an explosion occurs, fatally wounding Jack. He is rushed to the Huntington Memorial Hospital where he died pretty quickly. Now, here comes the very interesting part. There are many who say that his death was not an accident and that he was killed by the FBI. The final ruling or cause of the accident was that it was ruled that the explosion was caused when mercury fulminate ignited when Jack dropped a bucket containing the substance onto the floor. But close friends of Jack noted that Jack was always very careful when handling dangerous chemicals, and that in the years of working with explosives, he's never really had an accident. So whether you believe Jack was killed or if his death was an accident, that's up to you to decide. And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been your moment of Zen. And until next time, take care and stay fresh. See ya!